Warhammer 40,000. Space Marine 2 players praise the Emperor as dev rolls back controversial balance changes. Warhammer 40,000. Space Marine 2 developer Saber Interactive has announced an emergency patch to address unpopular nerfs and difficulty increases. It has also been announced that the game will be getting public test servers in early 2025, so fans can make their voices heard. Patch 4.1 will release this Thursday and will reduce Extremis enemy spawn rates, nerf Zoanthropes shield usage, and buff pretty much all bolt weapons. Warhammer 40k. Space Marine 2 has unveiled the official patch notes for Update 4.1, which will fix some of the issues caused by the previous unpopular update. Released in September, Warhammer 40k. Space Marine 2 is a popular multiplayer co-op shooter, but its most recent update caused some balance issues that angered its fanbase, and developer Saber Interactive has been quick to announce a solution. Warhammer 40,000. Space Marine 2 developer Saber Interactive has announced Update 4.1, set to hit the game on October 24th, and detailed its patch notes. Update 4.1 follows hot on the heels of last week's controversial Update 4.0, widely criticized by Space Marine 2's community for making the game significantly harder, even on easier difficulties. The backlash to Update 4.0 spread to Space Marine 2's Steam page, where disgruntled players review-bombed the game. The Update 4.1 patch notes were published alongside a message to fans from game director Dmitry Grigorenko, who, having digested the criticism of the last week, admitted, "The key takeaway for me, personally, is that I forgot that once the game comes out, it's no longer a dev's game. It's yours first and foremost." Thankfully, it seems all the noise and drama were enough to get developer Saber Interactive's attention, which has now announced that an emergency patch will be released this Thursday in an effort to address some of the recent complaints. Space Marine 2 director Dmitry Grigorenko announced the arrival of this update via some patch notes on the Space Marine subreddit, along with a lengthy statement thanking fans for the feedback. Grigorenko also took this opportunity to announce that Space Marine 2 will get public test servers in the near future, most likely in an effort to prevent major upsets like the one that has occurred over the last few days from happening at all. He claims that these servers will allow players to try out major balancing updates and make your voices heard before they go public, and that they'll be introduced at some point in early 2025. Warhammer 40,000. Space Marine 2 Update 4.1 Patch Notes. Gameplay and balancing tweaks. Operations Mode. AI Director and Enemy Spawns. DG. Here was our reasoning before patch 4.0. When the game came out in September, the ruthless difficulty win rate hovered around 60%. Weeks later, and with the changes introduced by patch 3.0, we saw that the same win rate had jumped to over 80%, and we received a lot of feedback stating that the game had become too easy, even at its maximum difficulty at the time. With patch 4.0, our aim was to tweak enemy spawns to increase the overall number of enemies rather than reverting to buffing their health. Unfortunately, this had an impact on the easier difficulty levels as well. For example, the win rate on the easiest difficulty dropped slightly after patch 4.0 from 95% to 93%. This may not look like a lot, but numbers aren't everything. Your feedback made it clear that the game had become more intense and stressful on lower difficulties, and this was never our intention. As I've personally emphasized in interviews, Space Marine 2 is all about the power fantasy, and patch 4.0 negatively impacted it for many of you. This is why we're rolling back these changes. Extremis enemies spawn rates in minimal, average, and substantial difficulties will revert back to their pre-patch 4.0 levels and will be significantly reduced in ruthless difficulty to hopefully strike a balance between how hard the game was at launch and how easy it became with patch 3.0. Minimal, average, and substantial difficulties. Reduce spawn rate of Extremis enemies to match pre-patch 4.0 levels. Ruthless difficulty. Significantly reduced spawn rate of Extremis enemies. Weapons. Only in operations mode. DG. We've been wanting to address the bolter family for a while, as they've been underperforming across all difficulty levels. This has been a frequent piece of feedback from many of you, and the data confirmed improvements were needed across the board. The percent damage increase is based on which classes have access to which kind of weapon and how the bolters compete with the other options available. Auto bolt rifle dash damage increased by 20%. Bolt rifle dash damage increased by 10%. Heavy bolt rifle dash damage increased by 15%. Stalker bolt rifle dash damage increased by 10%. Marksman bolt carbine dash damage increased by 10%. Instigator bolt carbine dash damage increased by 10%. Bolt sniper rifle dash damage increased by 12.5%. Bolt carbine dash damage increased by 15%. Oculus bolt carbine dash damage increased by 15%. Heavy bolter dash damage increased by 5%. Difficulty. Gear Ruthless. Player's armor is increased by 10%. DG. We are partially rolling back the change from the previous patch on Ruthless difficulty following your feedback. With patch 4.1, we're hoping to find the right compromise between how easy Ruthless difficulty felt after patch 3.0 and how it felt after last week's patch 4.0. The reason why it was reduced last week was that we noticed a very substantial bump in win rates on Ruthless after patch 3.0, as Minori's enemies would no longer remove the entire armor bar with their attacks. Ranged AI damage was nerfed across the board, and the ability to regenerate armor by parrying normal Minori's attacks was added. Additional note, despite the last patch notes listing a decrease in armor in substantial difficulty, this change was mistakenly left out of our last update, hence why you won't see it being reverted as part of this week's patch. Gear Lethal. Tight formations system is removed. DG. Before anything else, let us clarify our reasoning for the introduction of this mechanic. As we worked on adding a new difficulty tier, we needed to make sure this new challenge was meaningful and interesting. With tight formation, our objective was to add a new layer of challenge for our most skilled players by adding horizontal progression rather than just vertical progression, i.e., dealing more damage to ever stronger enemies. This game is about the power fantasy, and enemies that take dozens of melee hits break it. Thus, the challenge needed to come from other sources. This system was also designed as a first step towards the introduction of gameplay modifiers down the line, both negative and positive, something World War Z players will be familiar with, but your feedback showed that the proximity requirements felt too restrictive. Classes like Assault and Vanguard felt especially penalized as playing them effectively requires a certain freedom of movement. As a result, we're removing the system entirely and will continue to work on modifiers until they're ready. We will continue to monitor your feedback after the deployment of patch 4.1 to make sure lethal difficulty feels as challenging and rewarding as it should. Gear AI. DG. A recurrent piece of feedback we've seen is that the AI allies can feel useless at times. We already improved allies' behavior in patch 3.0, and we hope this additional buff will help solo players complete their operations.